So without further ado, Will, why don't you go ahead and introduce our next guest?
Absolutely. So Andrew Griffith is a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and the Environics Institute. He is a former Director General of Citizenship and Multiculturalism at Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, and has worked for government departments in Canada and abroad. He is now a blogger, author, social commentator, and frequently writes pieces about immigration policy issues.
All right, so let's go ahead and welcome Andrew. Welcome,
Okay.
Andrew. We're glad to have you in.
Thanks for having me.
So, Will, why don't you go ahead and start us off with the first question?
Alrighty. So, Andrew, if you can start generally with giving us a quick overview. I know you've written a lot of pieces, and we're going to share those links with our readers as well. But what are the key foundational platform issues of the major political parties as it pertains to immigration?
Okay, well, I guess I would start off by saying that in terms of the three major political parties, and perhaps with the Greens added to that, is you can see the general Canadian consensus in favor of immigration, that immigration is a net positive for the country. And so I think the differences between the parties need to be considered in that context. When I look at the individual parties, if I look at sort of the Liberal Party, it's basically sort of more of the same kind of messaging, stating the things they will do and being silent on the things that they don't want to talk about, like all political parties. And I think the thing that I found probably the most interesting on the Liberals in many ways is they didn't talk about the levels, because they've made, a lot of messaging around how proud they are to be able to meet the targets of 400,000 at a time of economic downturn and COVID, and yet that appears nowhere in the platform. It just surprises me. The Conservatives, I would say, is that they're trying to play in the same kind of general space as supportive of immigration, but they put in a few wrinkles in that, which may be sort of addressing concerns that they've heard from their base and others. I mean, I think it's interesting that refugees, they're really trying to move away from government-assisted refugees towards privately sponsored refugees. And I almost wonder if that's a nod towards PPC supporters, where the PPC explicitly calls for no longer taking refugees from the UN. I don't know that, but it's in a question. The other thing that is also interesting is the whole idea of expedited processing fees for immigration. And it surprises me that that hasn't attracted more attention or more scrutiny, because we all know with healthcare how the bogeyman of two-tier healthcare plays out. And this is sort of the same kind of approach with respect to immigration. Now, you can make some valid policy rationales for providing additional support for those who do that. And you can make a case in the situation of employers with respect to temporary foreign workers, but it surprises me. And the other element that sort of I found interesting, and I think is actually quite innovative, is really sort of looking at the family class and saying, well, do we actually need to have sort of more objective or some criteria that are more public through some form of point system? And I think that's to try and sort of, previous governments have always tried to address family class immigration, and no approach ever satisfies the public demand for that. And the other thing, of course, notable from the Conservative Party platform, and this gets to the absence, is that no reference to multiculturalism, no reference to anti-racism, and not even an anodyne reference, rather than the more detailed proposals of the Liberals, the NDP, and the Greens. And the NDP focuses more on refugees and family class. Again, it probably reflects some of their base concerns on those ones, but is silent on economic immigration, and is really silent in terms of how they would balance the three categories. And one quick note on the Greens, it tends to be closer to the NDP than any of the other platforms. The Bloc, of course, is all about more powers for Quebec, and we'll get into that a bit later. And the PPC is sort of the one alternative party that is, advocating for much lower levels of immigration and some reference to sort of, more right-wing views, which probably reflects sort of, they're the party that pulls some of the potential conservative voters to the right.
That's a really good overview of what's going on with all the party lines, and thank you for sharing your thoughts on that, Andrew. So, if you'll allow me, Will and I actually have listed a few key issues, more specific subtopics to what you just spoke about. So, first of all, I want to talk about the family class and refugee commitments. As a first point, is it a genuine care that they're actually talking about Afghanistan? And the first question should be, are they even talking enough about it? We all know now that at least the first 20,000 commitment from the Liberal government that was just dismissed was essentially just a reallocation of existing slots for refugees. They did say that they're going to top it up. Are you able to share us your thoughts about this particular crisis and the public outrage relating to Afghanistan and the spousal delays, actually, in terms of like the family class? We'll touch on that, but let's focus on Afghanistan for a second.
Well, I think it's really hard to understand how the government and governments around the world, quite frankly, so seriously underestimated the Taliban and how quickly the takeover would take place, and why once the agreement between the previous US administration, the Taliban came to fight, that people weren't doing more active preparation and more preemptive work. So I think there's a massive fail there on the part of governments around the world. It's not just limited to the Canadian government. So every government is probably playing a bit of catch up. And so, yes, the initial 20,000 was just sort of a reallocation. I mean, a valid reallocation. And the Liberals, of course, have now committed to another 20,000 spots, assuming they can get here or get to a safe third country. The other parties haven't made specific number commitments, but I would be very surprised that any government would have an overly restrictive approach to Afghan refugees, given what we know about the Taliban and given the initial signs. Now, there has been criticism, of course, that it's been overly bureaucratic and too many, crossing the T's and dotting the I's kind of approach. And I think those are valid. On the other hand, governments are always afraid of security threats and things like that. So I think there's a mix there that, we missed the boat, but we're not alone in missing the boat. And the test will really see over the next coming months of how many people we can actually admit, and encourage to come here. But I don't anticipate, any of the major parties would really have an overly restrictive point, because I think, we are responsible for a lot of those people, and there's, fortunately, there are a lot of the people, former military and the others, and the media that keep the visibility on those people. And I think that's a good thing.
I guess the question of the family class, just sort of building off of what you just said of refugees, it's, the second election with a refugee crisis, it seems like for family class and the challenges and delays, it seems like an issue that comes up every single election, and every party pledges, a whole slew of possible solutions and pitches it, but we're back talking about it again. So shifting now to that, is that because there is an issue behind the scenes that is just stopping even political power from being able to change anything? What are your perspectives on the family class?
I mean, I think the reality is that there will always be more demand for family class, whether it be parents and grandparents or spousal. And so governments have to make a choice between the various categories. And so you can argue that maybe close to 60% economic is too much compared to family class or refugees. But that's the fundamental trade-off that people are making. Now, one can also argue, is it really a valid trade-off? And I think, there are the discussions that can be had there. But it's, whether it be the previous conservative government, the current liberal government, it's always been an issue that has satisfied nobody. There's always, whether you tried a lottery system, whether you tried first enter, first applicant, there's always been problems there. So that's why I think in many ways that the conservative idea of actually trying to put in place some form of point system or equivalent where there are criteria that you explicitly prioritize, it's not going to be an easy one to implement, because whenever you publish those criteria, people will be sort of saying, well, why this, why not that? But I think it's an interesting initiative to try and sort of shift the focus to an approach that perhaps hasn't been tried before.
And just on the point of like processing, I want to circle back into your point about, that thing that you mentioned at the top of the conversation, which was, priority processing for fees. As a follow-up, do you know of any other country that does this white glove visa processing proposal, apart from the usual suspects of golden visas from, countries that do investment, citizenship via investment?
I'm not, apart from the citizenship by investment kind of programs, whether it be EB-5 in the US or other programs, I'm not. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that other governments aren't thinking about that. And so it's something I should probably follow more closely in my readings to see if that's coming out.
We've heard from our actually Twitter followers that the UK and the United States have some form of expedited, and I think that the UK is sort of the one that is most obvious, where you pay a little more and get something decided quicker. But yeah, there are definitely concerns of pay to play and what happens to those who do not have the funds to pony up. And in a sense, though, COVID, I mean, the recent announcement of the TRV, I don't know, Andrew, if you have any comments on that, the government's instructions that they seem to be pulling back on a little bit now, but the ones that say you should withdraw your TRV and pay again if you want to get processed quicker.
Well, I think on it's to me, it's almost a philosophical point to me that I don't like the idea of differential fees for a government service unless there's a real valid reason for that. Like I can see that in the case of passports, for example. You need a passport renewal, you pay more money, you get it the next day. I mean, I can see that because you still have the option, like you should be able to plan ahead with your passport demands. I mean, that strikes me as more, but in terms of sort of immigration processing, unless it's really sort of business related and an employer, I just feel uncomfortable with it. It doesn't mean that other people can't make an argument for that, but the idea that you generate more revenue and that improves processing for everybody, it may be more of a wish than an actual fact.
I think also the layer of discretion, where we know that the approval rates of different applications is so divergent. So unlike a passport where you're going to get your passport unless you sort of really mess something up or you're ineligible, in a visa it could be any outcome.
That's right. That's right.
The more money you pay could be one of those influencing factors, right? So
yeah.
You've already started to talk about your, editorial thoughts on the kinds of programs that are being put on the plate here, Andrew. I'm curious about the balance of some of these proposals put forward by the parties running for government. What are your thoughts generally about the way that immigration is, factored into Election 44? Should they talk about it more? And there's actually criticism that compared to other elections, immigration doesn't play as much of a big role in terms of a conversation in this cycle. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it's a legitimate issue, and I think there are two sort of thoughts or two threads. So one is sort of John Ibbotson sort of saying, well, actually, we should be thankful that immigration is not an issue. We're avoiding some of the kind of polarization that other countries have experienced and continue to experience. So in one sense, not having it discussed actually reduces that risk. The counter argument is that if we're not discussing these issues, where do they get discussed? Because we know that immigration is significant. We know that the impact that immigration has on any range of issues in the country, ranging from infrastructure, housing, social cohesion, integration, inclusion, whatever. And so in one sense, by not having such a limited discussion, I think we're missing an opportunity. But the risk is, of course, if you have that discussion, you can increase further polarization. So my general bias is we probably should be having a bit more discussion, but it's hard to ignore the fact that whenever it becomes an issue, it becomes polarizing. So, but hiding issues under the rug usually, eventually they crawl from under the rug anyway. So better to have some discussion of them, at least in the macro level, than not, in my view.
In terms of the political platforms, and sorry, this is a question that I don't know if I'm phrasing it perfectly, but other than the PPC, who seems to be very ideologically influenced, it seems like with immigration, there is a bit of like that circle catch-all where at a certain point in time, even the far left and the far, and not the far left, but the left and the right can meet on certain points. Is that a good thing for immigration, generally speaking, or is that something that poses a challenge?
Well, I mean, I think it's a net positive that the major parties are all, what I would call in the pro-immigration space. And it doesn't mean that some of the differences between the parties are not important or significant, but I think it's actually, a good sign that basically they all should be able to work together on immigration if they're in a minority government situation, because there's a fair degree of agreement. Where it becomes a problem is that if they're not willing to have a discussion, like I think there's a legitimate policy debate on levels in the current context and even in the longer term context. And that's where I think we're losing something, because by not being able to have an open discussion of what are the appropriate levels, does it make sense in the current context of COVID? Does it make sense 5 years from now? Does it make sense 10 years from now for those? So that's what we're losing. But, to paraphrase, the famous quote by Kim Campbell, elections are no time for policy discussions. There's an element of truth, because that's a more complex issue that you can't really capture in a soundbite in a debate.
Transitioning now back to the different parties, I know you mentioned that from the conservative side, the pay to play maybe brings some concerns in terms of expedited fees. You do quite like the possibility of maybe moving to a point system, or at least looking at the possibility. What about some of the other ideas? For example, the Liberals' citizenship fee. They want to get rid of citizenship fees for the grants. Is that something that, and I think they promised that last election too? Is this the second time around?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
so why didn't they implement it? is my question. They had 2 years to do that. Well, you could say COVID and everything like that. The COVID is sort of like a get out of jail card, if you want to use that expression. Previously, I'd always argued that that the high fees that were introduced in 2014-15 were too high, too exorbitant. $1,400 for a family of 4, more or less. But you could actually sort of have a more mid-range, which would sort of reflect the fact that the costs have gone up, that there are both personal benefits as well as their public policy benefits. So I never would advocated going as low as eliminating the fees, but I said lower fees were important. Sorry for that little digression.
No.
Yeah, and I know you touched on this a little bit earlier. You've hinted on this. The NDP's thoughts or pitch essentially to remove the caps on parent and grandparent sponsorship. And I've heard advocates talk about this, and they usually reference countries such as the US, for example, where there are no caps for immediate family sponsorship and even parent sponsorship and grandparent sponsorship, or petitions, as they call them in the US. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts again is that, the governments are trying to balance, whatever government comes in, they have to sort of balance between, like, how many people do you want under one category versus another? And so if you eliminate the caps, the implication is you're probably going to be crowding out economic or perhaps refugees or perhaps a mixture of both. And so I think you really have to have some form of notional targets. And the question is, how do you allocate those spaces in a way that's as fair and as reasonable as possible? And the other thing is, one of the major arguments that immigration advocates make, of course, with immigration is with respect to the aging population, and that immigrants basically help the overall population age at a less rapid rate. And of course, parents and grandparents don't help that. I mean, they provide other benefits like childcare for families and things like that. So I'm not saying they're a net negative, but I think if you're concerned about the demographics, then you also have to question how many parents and grandparents we should enter compared to international students transitioning or younger families or whatever.
I want to shift the topic a little bit to a bit of future casting here. I'm curious about your thoughts about post-COVID changes and kind of like what COVID actually gave us a glimpse of. For example, creating programs for what Canada deems to be as low-skilled or semi-skilled. And I want to kind of use France as a point of reference, where they not only gave status, but they gave citizenship to people who were working in the front lines. I mean, people will sort of compare it to the Ange Gardien that Quebec has implemented. What are your thoughts about having a post-COVID, more permanent solution or fix to, this acknowledgement that, these low-skilled or semi-skilled are, after all, essential workers?
Well, I think it is rather striking, and I think you've noticed it as well, is France was able to give 12,000 healthcare workers citizenship, pretty expedited process. And our sort of special administrative stream, or whatever it's called, for healthcare workers that had 20,000 slots, only about 4,000 or so have been accepted so far. So it's, to my mind, there's been some failure there, and others have written about some of the burdens there. So I think for healthcare workers, and then you see that in some of the party platforms, that they make a nod towards healthcare workers and other essential workers. But the proof will really be how quickly can you do it, and how effectively you will do it, because I think the government hasn't quite succeeded in addressing that issue yet, and it's an area that I think there's fairly broad public support for that, because everybody at some point in time goes to a hospital and needs these kind of support that people can provide.
Looking with your forward lens as well, I know our big conversation as of COVID are the backlogs that many individuals around the world are facing, families being separated, the use now of technology and tools available to IRCC, artificial intelligence, the potential bias in those processes. I know you've been writing about that as well, and you were heavily involved in that when you were on the IRCC side in terms of if I'm not mistaken, shaping some of these programs and ideas. And what do you think about the state we're in now? And do you have any concerns about the forward-looking future of technology and backlogs?
Okay, first of all, I left IRCC before this stuff was really being talked about or worked on, so I don't have any inside experience. I have assisted or attended some sessions where there was a person from IRCC who was actually explaining how it was done in the temporary visa program. And I was actually, along with other people, were quite impressed in terms of how the measured approach and how they, did some tests to make sure that, comparing human and AI things to try and minimize the risks of algorithmic bias. And we know from, everything we read with Facebook and others that there are those are real risks, and they have to be looked at very carefully. That being said, we have to recognize that all systems have biases, including ones that are determined by humans. And so we have to look at these technologies because the numbers are such that we can't do it by humans, that you still want to make sure that the initial filtration can be done efficiently by AI. You want to make sure that the AI algorithms are tested thoroughly for bias and for what is, legitimate bias versus illegitimate bias, because all immigration programs have a certain degree. They're discriminatory, right? You deal with this every day when you're fighting for your clients. And so that, to my mind, is crucial, is not whether AI and automation, but how do we ensure that the AI and automation is as bias-free as possible and meets equity considerations, and that there aren't things being introduced there that actually make it unfair for one group versus another.
Right. And, we're about at the end of the conversation here, Andrew, and thanks for your thoughts on prognosticating and looking forward. And to sort of tie it into my question, what would be your advice to the incoming Minister of Citizenship and Immigration?
Well, I mean, my advice is that immigration is too important to just leave to the normal processes. So I've been advocating in recent months that we really need some form of royal commission or a board of inquiry to look at immigration, not just in the short term, but in the longer term. We need to sort of say, what is going to be the impact over the next 10 or 20 years? We know there'll be more automation, there'll be more use of AI. So what kind of immigrants do we need in that kind of context? Do we need as many if truck drivers are eventually going to be replaced by autonomous vehicles, do we need as many truck drivers, just for example? And these are issues that intrinsically it's hard for governments to do on the fly. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, officials are probably thinking about these issues and they're probably doing some good work. But by having an outside commission that can take a longer term perspective and look at these issues, and whether it be with respect to immigration or the whole sort of area of multicultural anti-racism, these are all complex issues that we need to sort of have some bodies sort of step back, much as we did in the 60s with the Bilingualism Biculturalism Commission, because that actually provided some intellectual capital that subsequent governments could draw on in terms of legislation and the like.
Any final thoughts for the voter heading into the election, with immigration on their mind? I mean, they're looking right now, they're not seeing it in the mainstream media, as LJ just asked you, as this is an issue coming up. As someone who's looked at the different political parties, what would you sum up? What should they be thinking about if immigration is their issue?
Well, I think they should be thinking about what are their concerns, and then how do the political parties propose to respond to those concerns, or if they do at all. Both the specific proposals as well as those blank spaces on the comparative table. And I think the other thing that, of course, all voters have to do is that, most voters aren't single issue voters. Mm-hmm. And so in one sense, like, while I deeply care about immigration, I also deeply care about climate issues and COVID relief. And so recognizing that no one party has a perfect response to all the issues that I have to consider when exercising my vote, you have to think about which issues are more important. In some cases, it may be immigration related issues related to family reunification. In other cases, it may be climate change. In other cases, it may be an economic issue. And so voters have to sort of balance those. It doesn't make it easy, but life isn't easy, right?
Well, on that note, I think we should thank Andrew for taking time this morning, sharing his wisdom and again, his resources. We're going to be putting up a link to Andrew's excellent work, I think, especially for the voter who doesn't have hours to pour through and control find on each PDF of each party's platform. Andrew has done an incredible job making this digestible, and for sure I'm going to be referring to it before I vote as well. So thank you, Andrew, for taking time. Thank you for all your advocacy, and we look forward to collaborating with you more in the future.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity. Really enjoyed the conversation. I hope it's been useful to your viewers.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, well, Will, consider my mind blown. I'm still thinking about all of the, information and all of the opinions that were shared to us by all of our guests today. My thoughts are, I think I'm going to echo Andrew's points, is think about the issues that are dear to you, that are close to heart when you're thinking about who to vote for in the coming elections. 6 days, essentially. But yeah, we'll share some of the links and resources that we've accumulated in the last few days in preparation for recording this episode. They'll be in the description of this video. And thank you so much for listening in to this episode. And doing this extra episode was a pleasure. It was such a ride listening to such brilliant people, and I hope that you guys learned as much as I did.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's going to sound almost stereotype, but we have the power of the vote, right? And whether or not you believe in this current system, it is a privilege, and I believe a responsibility to show up to your fellow Canadians on the 20th. We have a lot of building to do, but they can't really change things if we don't tell them we want the change. So I think one common theme of this show was all our guests saying, listen to my perspective, hear me out. And I think one way that we can hear them is by exercising our power of vote.
And I guess as a final point, Will, there were common points, actually, common thread between the three guests. It's essentially that you have a seat at the table. We are in Canada. We are fortunate to have a voice. And a lot of people, I understand, they don't use that voice, but keep in mind that a lot of people fight and die for having that voice, to be able to sit at the table. So please, please, please exercise your fundamental right and responsibility to vote. On that note, thank you so much for listening in. And we have a lot of stuff in store for you for season 2 of Immlight. See you in a few.
See you in a few.